always wonderful to be back. It's great to see faces that I would never otherwise see, for the most part, and good to see so many new faces this time around, and I welcome those of you who are here for the first time. As Don says, I do a lot of freelance writing for Chronicles magazine and occasionally for other venues. I'm a literary person, not a historian, but as it turns out, partly with the connivance of Clyde Wilson, I sometimes end up talking on or writing on historical matters, and he's bailed me out on a number of occasions. Prevented me from embarrassing myself horribly, but this is a solo flight. I didn't send him a single email, so you're taking your risks here. I'm talking about segregation today. What I've titled The Strange Career of Segregation. For those of you, how's my voice doing, by the way? Okay. For those of you who have read C. Vann Woodward's seminal work, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, you know where the title comes from. It's just a slight alteration with the tip of a hat to C. Vann Woodward, whose book on Jim Crow, which went through several editions, is I think, undoubtedly the seminal work on that particular subject. I mean, you can't wade into it at all, even today in recent historical studies, without constantly running across his name, people trying to refute his arguments, people trying to support his arguments. There's no way around C. Vann Woodward. And I will refer to some of his ideas here in the course of the paper. Now, I'm not going to jump right into Jim Crow. I'm going to begin with the antebellum and colonial periods, try to get through that fairly quickly, because you really can't understand segregation, legalized segregation, formal segregation, very effectively unless you see it in this longer historical context. So I'll move through the colonial antebellum period, the Reconstruction and Redeemer periods. All of this is a whirlwind tour, I promise, before talking more about Jim Crow itself. In the beginning, there was no segregation, certainly not in the sense that we commonly use that term today. I mean, in the South. Consider in evidence our Southern distinctiveness, which is rooted in a folk culture compounded of black and white influences. Our modes of speech, our rich cuisines and rites of conviviality, our varied and original musicality, our arts and crafts, our storytelling traditions, our sometimes unbridled passion for sport, our legends and superstitions, our humor, and our attitudes toward work and leisure. In all of these ways, we have a shared culture. From the South Carolina Sea Islands to the piney woods of East Texas, these overlapping folk traditions thrive. And despite many local variations and anomalies, they bind Southerners together into a unique people, regardless of race or class. This shared culture is rooted ultimately in that fateful decision in 17th century Virginia and the Carolinas to import slave labor to the New World. As more than one historian has noted, African slavery was a relatively late development in the northern states. When slaves arrived in places like New York or Pennsylvania, they entered long-established communities and had very little role in shaping the local cultures, certainly not the cuisine. Okay. Indeed, in the North, they, meaning slaves, were never more than 10% of the slave population of the whole of colonial America. So 90% of the slave population in colonial America was in the South. In the South, slaves were among the earliest settlers. Blacks and whites in the South have always been fellow travelers and have, as often as not, lived cheek by jowl, at least until recently. Nowhere is the reality of African influence so forcefully illustrated as in the history of Charleston, where enslaved Africans arrived with their Barbadian masters in the 1670s. Together, they cleared the swamps. Together, they shared the perils of the Yamasee War and harvested the first crop of Carolina gold. Not marijuana, by the way. Creating the rice culture that would make Charleston one of the busiest and wealthiest ports in the New World. Indeed, the folk culture that emerged in the Carolina Lowcountry was a unique blend of European and African practices. If the foodstuffs which graced the table of the big house were more plentiful than the fare consumed in the slave quarters, the recipes were often much the same, and often African in origin. Think yams and hominy grits. If black slaves brought with them indigenous musical styles, they also adopted European instruments like the fiddle, without which no Christmas feast on the Lowcountry plantations would have been complete. Similarly, the Lowcountry dialect was a fusion of English, West African, and Caribbean speech, or Caribbean, whichever is your preference. The Gullah of the slave population was distinct but not so far removed from the common speech of the masters. Most importantly, perhaps, blacks and whites in Carolina shared a common piety, and if the black expression of that faith veered toward a more potent enthusiasm, it's also true that the plaintive hymns of the enslaved subtly shaped and informed the spiritual lives of the masters. It might be interesting to attempt a counterfactual history in which a strict segregation had been imposed upon the African population from the start, something not unlike the Jim Crow regime which came later, and consider whether this shared and distinctive culture could ever have flourished. But of course, what if histories are a fool's game? Or as the Gullah proverb would have it, dog got 4 feet but can only walk one road. I'll let you mull that one over. While colonial and antebellum Southern society was undoubtedly a hierarchically arranged system of white dominance, one which involved some degree of exclusion, segregation was not a significant factor. I'll try and clarify that distinction as we go along. What was true of the Carolina Lowcountry was true across the South. To understand the extent of the integrated lives of blacks and whites in the Old South, it will be helpful to consider how their lives played out daily on those plantations, large, middling, and small, that were the site of the predominant mode of life, keeping in mind that roughly only a tenth of the Southern population, well into the 20th century, resided in towns or cities. The key idea here is the idea of the plantation household, which was so much more than a private dwelling. As Elizabeth Fox Genovese has written, quote, "It contained within itself the decisive relations of production and reproduction." And each of these was a part of a vast network of such households that pervasively shaped the character of Southern society. In the North, a separation of spheres had already emerged, in keeping with the evolution of the capitalist market economy, which divided the private realm, the realm of familial affections, from the public sphere of production. Any attempt to understand Southern society without drawing this contrast is doomed to fall well short of the mark. In the Southern household, masters, mistresses, their children, and their slaves all considered themselves part of an extended family, sharing both familial affection and the labor which was essential to their flourishing. Naturally, most 21st century Americans would scoff at such an assertion. How could those who were subjected to such a brutal and unjust system, I'm echoing the kinds of objections that might arise, how could those who were subjected to such a system genuinely consider themselves part of the plantation family? But the evidence for this goes well beyond pro-slavery polemics or the idealized worlds of lost cause fiction. It is borne out not only in the diaries and letters of masters and mistresses, but in voluminous slave narratives taken down after the war. Many of these are quoted at some length in Genovese's Within the Plantation Household, a wonderful work if you haven't read it. This is not to say that slaves did not often resent and resist the power of the master. Of course they did. Or that they preferred their enslavement to freedom. Rather, it seems that resentment and resistance coexisted with a tradition of mutual expectations and reciprocal responsibilities that Eugene Genovese calls paternalism. This paternalistic ethos, widely accepted by the planters, was succinctly stated by antebellum Mississippian E.N. Eliot, who wrote that, quote, slavery is the duty and obligation of the slave to labor for the benefit of both master and slave, under a warrant to the slave of protection and a comfortable subsistence. Eliot placed great stress on the rights of the slave, not only the right of protection and subsistence, but of counsel and guidance, of care and attention in sickness and old age. There were, no doubt, planters who fell short, even woefully short, of this standard. But the paternalist idea, leavened by Christian influence, was deeply internalized by the planters. It was, for most of them, the cornerstone of their self-respect. Consider some of the ways in which blacks and whites interacted in the plantation household, whether under the demands of mutual obligation or by the simple exigencies of daily life. The middling sort of plantation, those having less than 50 slaves and not more than 1,000 acres under cultivation, were predominant. But aside from the smallest yeoman plantations, most of these were like little self-sufficient villages in which the races mingled unceasingly. At the center was the big house, of course, and surrounding it in close proximity were numerous other structures: barns, smokehouses, carriage houses, various kinds of storage facilities, workshops, mills, slaughterhouses, and of course slave quarters. These latter almost always within sight of the big house. Yes, that had partly to do with surveillance. Hardly an hour of the master's day would pass without some dealings with slaves, or servants as they were usually called. At the breakfast table, in dealing with slave disputes or requests, in riding his fields to ensure that the work was proceeding properly, or inspecting livestock, at evening meals, or at his leisure, which might take many forms, most of which entailed the presence or the active involvement of slaves. This was especially true of hunting and fishing, usually male activities, and almost always involving both masters and slaves, young and old. And it is likely that the same master was in infancy nursed by a slave, just as his own children would be nursed, perhaps by the same slave woman or her daughter, since these roles were often passed down. Indeed, slave children and white children were often nursed together. One slave, Mattie Logan, recalled that she was born about the same time as her mistress's daughter, Jenny. Now quoting from Mattie, "They say that I nursed on one breast while that white child pulled away at the other," end quote. Visiting Northers were often shocked by this sort of thing. No doubt it offended their prim sense of Yankee propriety. And in fact, they often expressed their shock at how familiar the lives of white masters and mistresses were with their slaves. As for the mistress of the household, if anything, she was even more deeply involved in the lives of the servants. While she did not typically work in the kitchen alongside her black cook, she supervised the menus, managed the kitchen garden, and generally kept watch over all household activities related to the woman's sphere. Providing for the clothing of slaves, sometimes a huge job, fell within that sphere. So her duties included the management of all spinning, weaving, and dyeing, some of which she was adept at herself, but most of which involved skilled slave women. She was expected as well to attend to the health of the slaves, to visit the sick in the slave quarters, and to ensure their proper medical care. In the event of a slave death, it was her duty to arrange proper burial. The diaries and narratives attest frequently to the sincere grief that many masters and mistresses felt over the deaths of trusted and beloved servants, some of which may well have been their playmates when they were children. Gone with the Wind wasn't wrong about everything. In fact, it got quite a bit right. Finally, before moving on to the period following the war, I must note the shared traditions of worship on the plantation. The literature on this issue is complex, so I'm just taking you through it in a simplified fashion. Early on, prior to the Revolution, masters appeared to have been largely indifferent about the beliefs and religious practices of their slaves, and in the 18th century, it should be noted, fervent religious practice was not habitual among the planters themselves. With the advent of the 19th and the growing influence of evangelical religion, propagated especially by Baptist and Methodist preachers, the large number of slave conversions to Christianity appear to have been mostly sincere. The planters were not untouched by those same currents. Many pious masters provided for chapels on plantation grounds, encouraged slave worship, again to some extent for reasons of surveillance, and in some cases even presided over worship, including daily worship. After the Nat Turner and Stono uprisings, the planters became especially attentive to the spiritual needs of their slaves, believing that Christian influence properly supervised would help to prevent further disturbances of that kind. As you may know, for those of you who have taken a look at the map, the Stono River runs along one side of Kiowa, it's within a few miles as the crow flies. After Appomattox, everything changed, and yet, in a certain sense, much stayed the same. Initially, the freed plantation slaves were reluctant to return to the plantations, even as wage laborers, but other economic opportunities were scarce. Some, it's true, were able to purchase confiscated land for very low prices, as was the case in parts of the Low Country, especially in the Sea Islands, properties which became known as heirs' properties. Many did eventually return to the land as wage laborers, and many others eventually found a place all over the South as sharecroppers and tenants in the crop lien system, which gave them at least the semblance of economic independence. But despite such changes, the integration of black and white cultures remained the norm in the rural areas primarily, and to a lesser extent in the towns, though it is true that some voluntary segregation occurred, most notably in the churches. However, it is at this point that I must briefly review the central controversy in the history of the segregation story, that is, prior to Jim Crow in the early 1890s. In the strange career of Jim Crow, C. Vann Woodward had argued in the first edition that when segregation did appear during Reconstruction, it was, with a few exceptions, voluntary, and even then not extensive enough to justify any attempt to, quote, equate this period in racial relations with either the old regime of slavery or with the future rule of Jim Crow. The old antebellum paternalism did not dissolve overnight, though it was often strained, to be sure. Of course, one of the aims of the radical Republicans was to achieve both political equality and social integration. And we should allow, if we're being completely objective here, that segregation might have accelerated more rapidly prior to the rise of the Redeemers had not Republican dominance enforced some degree of integration. I don't find that entirely convincing. I just wanted to throw that out as a possibility. Yet, even under Reconstruction rule, some forms of segregation appeared without interference from the Republicans. For example, public school segregation in North Carolina has been well documented. Now, among Woodward's critics, I would note especially Joel Williamson in his book, After Slavery, The Negro in South Carolina During Reconstruction. That came out in 1965, but is still widely debated. Williamson challenges Woodward's argument at some length, concluding that during Reconstruction, quote, segregation had already crystallized into a comprehensive pattern. So as early as the late 1860s. Williamson makes much of the few cases of documented non-voluntary segregation, and a good deal more of what he sees as a clear pattern of voluntary segregation. But he does so without properly contextualizing the frequent instances of mutual distrust that had emerged between the races at war's end. For example, he quotes a traveler from Boston who, passing through Charleston in 1865, reported on the, quote, growth of a bitter and hostile spirit between blacks and whites, end quote. Williamson cites a number of examples of such a hostile spirit, but leaves the impression that this hostility on the part of whites was a fundamentally irrational racism that had always been implicit in the ideology of white superiority, and which became uglier and more aggressive when blacks were no longer restrained by the yoke of slavery. Yet in spite of all this, he admits that there is, quote, no clear, concise answer to the question of why separation occurred. He says this while failing to give proper weight to the degree to which whites felt threatened by the radical Republican regime. It is well to remember that this was a time when the Northern armies had not yet withdrawn, when land confiscation and the threat of widespread redistribution was still an ongoing enterprise, and when state legislatures were dominated by radical Republicans. To say nothing of the daily frictions which occurred in the towns and cities when whites accustomed to obeisance were confronted by sometimes unruly and aggressive displays of social equality on the sidewalks and in public conveyances. This all seems to point toward a fairly clear and concise answer to Williamson's question. Under the circumstances, it's hardly surprising that some degree of voluntary separation occurred during Reconstruction, though the measure of that distance between the races is hard to ascertain. The circumstances varied a good deal from state to state, and hard evidence is sparse. Much of Williamson's argument relies on anecdotal evidence, and a good deal of which has the appearance of cherry picking. And of course, he was focused almost exclusively on South Carolina, which is of course an exception in every possible way. Nevertheless, a number of contemporary historians lean toward his side in the debate. Responding to his critics in the third edition of Strange Career, Woodward doesn't deny the existence of pockets of voluntary segregation, or for that matter, some instances of enforced segregation, but rejects the notion that any substantial pattern of proto-Jim Crow, my words, segregation was already being established. Instead, he views the period as one full of, quote, cross-currents and contradictions, revolutionary innovations, and violent reactions. Violent reactions within which the racial relations of the old regime often persisted stubbornly into the new order. In short, it was a period of instability that couldn't endure for very long. After 1877, the so-called Redeemers ushered in a new era of home rule, but initially changed little in the realm of race relations. They did not seek to expand segregation in the sweeping fashion that would be typical of the Jim Crow regimes in the 1890s, a generation later. On the contrary, they for the most part acquiesced, at least in the early years of their rule, to the reality of the black franchise and went out of their way to appeal to black voters. And what they offered the freedmen can be summed up in a single word: protection. The Redeemers were transitional figures in a period fraught with political and economic conflict. At one extreme of the Southern political spectrum was the rising power of the radical wing of the Democratic Party, the faction of racial extremists. On the other, the increasingly influential voices of the populists, initially known as the Farmers' Alliance, for whom the racial question was secondary to the message of class warfare that drew millions of small farmers to their ranks, both black and white, I should add. The Redeemers needed black votes to solidify their own vulnerable position. nor did many of them seem to have any stomach for a segregationist message that they associated with the white lower classes. I should say that in South Carolina, the biggest concentration of support for the Redeemers was here in Charleston and the Charleston News and Courier. Thus, the leading Redeemers sought to keep alive the old paternalism, to offer themselves to black voters as their protectors against the increasingly rancorous threat of the radical segregationists. It may be the case that what Eugene Genovese calls a residue of the old sense of duty was more important than their political ambition. Maybe. Yet it should also be noted that large numbers of Redeemers were old Whigs in new wigs, so to speak. They were closely allied with the economic forces that would come to be associated with the New South. I'll talk more about this on Thursday. They sat on the boards of railroads alongside their Yankee counterparts, as well as the boards of textile and steel enterprises, and generally saw the populists, especially as the 1890s approached, as their bête noire. If it was necessary to compromise with the segregationists to maintain power against what was widely perceived as a socialist threat, so be it. By the late 1880s, the tide was beginning to turn, and in the midst of a major economic recession, the policies of the Redeemers were compromised either by their own willingness to collude with the extremists or by the growing power of the extremists as power brokers. Even as early as 1877, it should be noted, even so venerated a figure as Wade Hampton won the governor's race in South Carolina only with the support of the infamous Ben Tillman, later to become senator, who by then already controlled a decisive block of upcountry Democratic voters. But there are other factors involved in the almost 2 decades delay in the onslaught of Jim Crow legislation, which really didn't achieve a full head of steam until the mid-1890s, especially after the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson decision. That was a decision involving a New Orleans streetcar, a segregated New Orleans streetcar. While Woodward's critics saw plenty of evidence of continuity where he saw discontinuity, and while a good deal of that evidence is valid, Woodward's thesis remains relevant. The Jim Crow era was not inevitable, and one overlooked factor in the sudden rush to de jure segregation is the issue of class. This just keeps coming up again and again as I read the evidence. In an uncertain economic environment, many white voters, especially poor whites, but not exclusively so, feared black competition. It is difficult to disentangle deeply felt racial hatred from the fear that one's economic well-being or one's fragile class status might be imperiled. One thinks here of William Faulkner's memorable short story, Barn Burning. Anybody read that one? In which a white sharecropper of the 1880s, Abner Snopes, justifies his barn burning as an inchoate act of class warfare against the Bourbon whites. I'm quoting, "I reckon I'll have a word with the man who aims to begin owning me tomorrow," he says, "body and soul," just a few days before he burns his last barn. The man is Colonel Sartoris, the landowner whose stately white mansion reminds or represents for Abner something built on nigger sweat. And if he, Abner, is going to be exploited by that same landowner, it must mean that his own sweat will be of no greater value. In short, it's no real stretch to imagine that the radical segregationists were prepared to exploit such class resentments for their own purposes and to make blacks convenient pawns in their game. I hope you see here that I'm trying to, well, maybe you don't see, but what I'm trying to do here is to kind of make up for what I perceive as a gap in the literature on why Jim Crow arose when it did and with the sudden onrush that it did. Not that no one talks about class, but I don't think it gets quite enough emphasis. The fact is that black labor was essential for the rise of the New South, and blacks somehow had to be accommodated, while white agrarian radicals were, on the other hand, appeased. Blacks were increasingly disenfranchised by poll taxes, literacy tests, and other means, as were quite a few poor whites, by the way. But there is some evidence that among a segment of the black leadership, the segregation solution offered certain benefits. As Woodward had suggested, and as Howard Rabinowitz argued at greater length in 1988, the alternative to segregation by the 1890s appeared to be exclusion. To many black leaders, it appeared that there were really two paths into the future, either a return to something like the black codes of the late 1860s or segregation. The failed black codes of the 1860s had been an attempt at exclusion, a partial restoration of the antebellum status quo, and from the point of view of the black leadership, this remained an undesirable possibility, especially in view of the retreat of Northern Republicans from the goals of Reconstruction. The importance of this retreat, coincident with the rise of the reconciliationist sentiment in both the North and the South, is a factor that can hardly be overstated. Here, Joel Williamson is pretty reliable. He's argued at some length that Northern Republican interest in black equality began to wane not long after Reconstruction. In fact, it was already beginning to wane at the time that Reconstruction came to an end. The abolitionists had found other causes, you might say. Yeah. So by the 1890s, politicians of both parties showed a disposition to use black people when they could and to abandon them when they could not, end quote. Moreover, as a number of historians have noted, the North was quite familiar with segregation laws, since these laws had been pioneered in the North prior to the war, something that Don Livingston has a good bit to say about in his forthcoming book. Should I say shortly forthcoming? Yeah. Okay, shortly forthcoming. Yes. The North was quite familiar with segregation laws, since those laws had been pioneered in the North prior to the war, and some persisted well after. In most northern states during the colonial and antebellum eras, numerous local ordinances restricted the movements of free blacks, segregated them by occupation, relegated them to undesirable neighborhoods, and ensured separation in education. Some states in the Midwest and the West sought to exclude blacks entirely. After 1896, Northern attitudes began to harden considerably, and even many of those who had most ardently supported the abolitionist cause looked with trepidation at the possibility of large numbers of blacks moving north, particularly since social and economic unrest among poor whites in the larger northern cities was at a critical stage. Hence, after the turn of the century, the North tacitly and then quite openly adopted a hands-off policy towards the South, allowing the proliferation of Jim Crow laws below the Mason-Dixon line, and by various means maintaining de facto segregation within their own states. During the late 1890s and in the first decade of the new century, Jim Crow laws in the South, now with the support of both radicals and conservatives, I'm using conservatives here synonymously with Bourbons, as I said earlier, proliferated dramatically. Segregation became the norm in restaurants, waiting rooms, hospital wards, sports and sporting facilities, prisons, transportation, though with considerable resistance from the streetcar companies, education, burial grounds, and in many other areas of Southern life. Notoriously, even some courtrooms had Jim Crow Bibles for the swearing in of blacks, a reality that some 20 years earlier had been proposed in jest by an anti-segregationist wag writing for the Charleston News and Courier. All of this is the fodder of high school textbooks, and I don't need to belabor it here. However, at this point, I would like to delve into two more areas of concern that have not been so widely discussed. The first of these involves the economics of what is called the job reservation system, Simply put, this means that under the Jim Crow regime, economic exclusion was used to reinforce segregation by forcing blacks out of or barring their entrance into whole categories of occupations. White-collar jobs, of course, were out of reach, but also various forms of skilled labor and supervisory positions. This exclusion was not always written into law, but more often than not took the form of a widespread understanding among white employers. John W. Sell, historian, in his book, The Highest Stage of White Supremacy, notes that, quote, coercive mechanisms were a mixture of formal arrangements and informal understandings and were pervasive. What is most interesting about this is that the job reservation system, in effect, prevented whites, quote, from behaving as rational economic persons, meaning that individual employers were unable to hire blacks for certain positions, even when doing so would have made more economic sense, since blacks, even when their level of skill was equal to that of white workers in a given occupation, could always be paid less. But this was common across the South. The importance of this observation is that it brings us back to the issue, once again, of class and to how the system of segregation was sometimes only superficially about race per se, but just as importantly about the manipulation of the white labor force in an era when the South's economy had begun to rebound but was still trailing far behind the rest of the country in its productive capacity. In short, the millions of blacks excluded from competing directly with whites in hundreds of occupations constituted what Sell calls a reserve army of labor. That's a phrase that has really stuck with me. A reserve army of labor, and was thus, quote, a potent weapon with which white workers could be threatened, intimidated, and isolated. Needless to say, under such conditions, labor unions made little headway in Dixie. And that remains largely true today, as I'm sure you're well aware. And finally, I want to turn to education. For this is probably the strangest part of the long and strange tale of segregation. Prior to Reconstruction, few blacks in the South had any education at all, and most were simply illiterate, as were many poor whites. Under Reconstruction mandates, what few public schools there were integrated, or there were attempts at integrating them, and in some places like New Orleans, with some success for more than a decade. With the arrival of the Redeemers, the literacy rates were still dismal, but in the rush to industrialize, public schools were in greater demand. During the Jim Crow era, virtually all public schooling in the South was segregated. But black schools were hardly equal if the disproportionately low funding they were allocated is any indication. Yet many black leaders in the South remained optimistic about black education. They recognized that things could be worse and that many conservative white legislators across the South were at least making an effort to adhere to the letter of the separate but equal clause of Plessy versus Ferguson, that case I mentioned a few minutes ago. Black leaders foresaw the possibility of gradual advancement and worked to improve what access they had to public schooling, and of course to found black colleges. This is the era when Southern black colleges got off the ground. The most important of these leaders was Booker T. Washington, who had been born into slavery and who established himself as the preeminent voice in the South for a philosophy of gradualism, the preeminent black voice, most memorably expressed in his famous address known as the Atlanta Compromise speech in 1915, focusing especially on black businesses and education. As early as 1881, he had established the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama for training teachers who would then spread across the rural South and instruct black youth in the skills they needed for participating in the workforce as laborers, farmers, tradesmen. Within a few years of the Atlanta Compromise speech, however, Washington's ideas and influence were routinely attacked by Northern black activists such as W.E.B. Du Bois, as he pronounced his name. Looks like Dubois, pronounced Du Bois, who was active in the recently formed NAACP, one of the leaders, in fact, which regarded Washington as an obstacle to racial equality. In their view, he was infinitely prolonging the march to full equality while pandering to white elites in both the North and the South and encouraging an attitude of quiescent acceptance of the status quo among the black masses. This is the view that prevails even today, and few Americans have any idea just how successful he and his followers, Washington and his followers, were in improving the lot of blacks in the South. What I mean is that, for example, in the average high school, you might get a paragraph or two on Washington, and the view of him that is taken is usually the view of W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP. So much of this damage is the result of the way he's caricatured in history textbooks or in the popular media. And much can be attributed to the scathingly brilliant portrait of his philosophy offered up in Ralph Ellison's famous novel Invisible Man, a chapter of which is commonly anthologized in high school and college texts under the title Battle Royal, where the philosophy of gradualism is mocked relentlessly. It really is a brilliant novel. Which is what makes it such a dangerous novel in this instance anyway. Yet well before the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, which refers to the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, in 1954, bringing the era of school segregation to an end, Washington's disciples had done a great deal to build the character and effectiveness of black education in the South. Washington himself regarded segregation not chiefly as an obstacle to his goals, but as an opportunity. Direct competition with whites, especially perhaps in the area of education, he thought was premature. Separated from that debilitating arena of competition with whites, black children might thrive, and indeed there is evidence that in many cases across the South they did. One of those who looked upon Washington's accomplishments with approval was Zora Neale Hurston, whom many would regard as among the 2 or 3 most accomplished black writers of the 20th century. While Hurston was by no means a friend of Jim Crow, a system she denounced on numerous occasions, she was wary of the exclusive focus on civil rights promoted by the better-thinking Negro, as she phrased it, who ever more stridently called for political equality without providing poor blacks with the tools they needed to achieve real equality. Thus, she looked behind the militancy of Du Bois and the Harlem Cabal and their friends in the NAACP to the example of Booker T. Washington, whose philosophy of self-help sought to empower individuals and local communities. She notes with barely concealed scorn how the better-thinking Negro looked upon Washington as, quote, absolutely vile for advocating industrial education for blacks. And she gets this right. They did. They attacked that relentlessly. By contrast, left-leaning black leaders were already preparing the ground for the affirmative action policies of the present, policies which have worked to the advantage, of course, of the better-thinking Negro. Her words, while leaving the masses of poor blacks mired in a swamp of dependency. For her candor, Hurston was spurned by the liberal establishment and attacked by the likes of Langston Hughes, whose communist sympathies were well known, and who sought to portray Hurston as a traitor to the cause of black solidarity. It was all about the brothers, baby. You know how that goes. But her greatest transgression against the dogma of racial pride was her denunciation of the Supreme Court 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. I was astonished when I ran across this article of hers. The crux of her argument, published as a letter, actually, to the Orlando Sentinel in August 1955, is that the stated intent of the court to ensure equality of education for black school children was in effect a ruse. As is so often the case in her writing, she draws upon her store of Southern folkwism to present her case in quasi-allegorical fashion. And I quote, "Those familiar with the habits of mules are aware that any mule, if not restrained, will automatically follow a white mare. Dishonest mule traders made money out of this knowledge in the old days." She knew. She was from rural Florida and had written extensively about their ways. One need only to lead a white mare down a country road and, quote, slyly open a gate, and the mules in the lot would follow this mare. In the Brown decision, the white mare is the allegorical bait used to lead black folk, the mules, into a new captivity, an illusory equality that promised them little in the way of substantive improvement in the quality of black children's education. Critics of Hurston's argument, including her biographers, then and now, often dismiss it with the claim that only a woeful ignorance of the poor quality of education in segregated black schools could explain her failure to support the court's decision. And this is almost universal amongst those who have dealt with this argument of hers. But that isn't very likely. Hurston's own mother was a school teacher. Hurston herself worked, among her many jobs, as a substitute school teacher, and she traveled widely in the segregated South as an anthropologist, the discipline in which she was trained under Franz Boas, the best-known anthropologist of that era. What Hurston's critics have ignored, some self-styled conservative critics among them, are her apprehensions about the long-term implications of the Brown decision. Though she doesn't say as much in the Sentinel letter, it is likely that Hurston was fully aware that the Brown decision was reached not upon constitutional but psychological grounds. Among other studies cited by the court, some of you may be familiar with this, was the psychologist Kenneth Clark's finding that when given a choice between black and white dolls, black children more often choose white dolls. Sound familiar? Yeah. From this, Clark inferred that black children saw themselves as inferior, and the court agreed. As one legal expert has recently asked, quote, isn't it telling that the court did not even attempt to explain the less than obvious connection between how a black child describes black and white dolls and the relative effect of integrated versus segregated schools on that child's feeling of inferiority? They just made the claim, they didn't explore it. There was no psychological expertise brought to bear other than Kenneth Clark's findings. One might conclude, of course, that even as some constitutional originalists like Robert Bork, one might agree with such originalists as Robert Bork, that while the methodology of the Brown decision was flawed, the decision itself was nonetheless correct. If one measures correctness in this context by the achievement of a purely factitious equality, then perhaps Bork is right. But what is blindingly clear is that in the half-century since the implementation of Brown began with all deliberate speed, a quote from the Brown decision, very little real improvement in the quality of education for most black children has been achieved, down to the present. On the contrary, the American public school system is scandalously dysfunctional in virtually every respect, but particularly with regard to segregation, integration, and among other factors, Brown made this possible. What Hurston understood better than most in 1955 was that the Brown decision was a flagrant attempt at social engineering by the court, the sort of thing that has become all too frequent in recent decades. She warns in no uncertain terms against the implications of judicial activism. Quote, in the ruling on segregation, the unsuspecting nation might have witnessed a trial balloon, a relatively safe one, since it is sectional and on a matter not likely to arouse other sections of the nation in support of the South, but a precedent has been established. Government by fiat can replace the Constitution. Hurston also understood that segregated black schools were important centers of cultural life in black communities all across the South, centers that provided cohesion and support for precisely the kind of self-help ethic that Booker T. Washington had cultivated. Indeed, Hurston's opposition to Brown, despite the claims of her detractors, was not at all eccentric. Having surveyed a number of recent studies of the impact of Brown, historian Lynn Moylan notes, despite the lofty premises of Brown, the cultural connection and the vital sense of belonging and the ethic of caring characteristic of former all-black schools were in effect destroyed by the court system. Even former NAACP legal fund attorney Derek Bell, who at one time believed Brown to be the holy grail of racial justice, has recently conceded that he was woefully mistaken. That in fact the court should have enforced separate but equal funding for black schools. Such views, while not necessarily embraced in their entirety, are reinforced by, and I'm on the last page here, the works of a major scholar in this area, Adam Fairclough, whose books Teaching Equality, 2001, and A Class of Their Own, 2006, have provided abundant evidence of the vitality of segregated black schools. Fairclough is, of course, a liberal, but an honest one, which became not only centers of education, but the focal points of community and self-help all over the rural and urban South. Moreover, several recent studies by black scholars, such as Betty Jamerson Reed, herself once a student in an all-black school in North Carolina, built upon Fairclough's work and demonstrates, among other things, that as school integration approached in the wake of Brown, many black teachers and administrators viewed that transition with a mixture of hope and trepidation. While in their public statements they remained on the good side of the NAACP, in their letters, memoirs, and private statements they expressed fears that had been borne out by events. Of course, the final irony in this strange tale is that today, well over half a century after the Brown decision, and despite any number of attempts to force the issue through social engineering, American public schools and American society in general remains largely segregated, though one might suggest less so in the South in some important respects. And in fact, if this is true, that the North and the West are more segregated in many respects than the South, this could be explained in a number of ways. But I would venture to say, by way of ending where I began, that it has something to do with the fact that in the South, blacks and whites, despite many trials and tribulations, share a common identity that is not so prevalent in other regions of the country. Perhaps, too, it has something to do with the still dominant belief across the Christian South in the saving power of forgiveness, as demonstrated so vividly by the outpouring of forgiveness and generosity that prevailed in the wake of the Emmanuel Church shooting on that terrible evening in June 2015 here in Charleston. Amen.